All right. Good afternoon and good morning to everyone from coast to coast, and welcome to today's webinar, The State of Facilities in Higher Education, an in-depth look at the 2015 trends and best practices, presented by Sightlines Vice President Jim Fidamus. My name is Eric Nolan. I'm the Senior Marketing Manager at Sightlines. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I'll be moderating today's session as we delve deeper into the data and trends that informed our 2015 State of Facilities report and provide an insight into the importance of having clearly defined policies around space management, capital allocation, and facilities operating practices to make real change on campus. Now, before we get started, let's quickly review today's agenda. First is a quick overview of Sightlines in our database of 345 institutions with over 400 campuses across North America, totaling roughly 1.5 billion gross square feet. Then we'll do an extensive review of the 2015 facilities trends, some of which you've already seen in the report, some that are exclusive to this webinar. We'll provide a preview of the trends and what to expect in our upcoming State of Sustainability report. We'll then explore the factors for why the roof hasn't caved in despite these seemingly bad news trends and dire predictions, and then finally, recommendations and concluding strategies. Lastly, I'd like to remind you all that if you have any questions or comments during the presentation, please don't hesitate to share those with us. We'd like this to be an interactive session, and we very much look forward to answering any questions that come up along the way. I'll be monitoring them throughout the presentation, and we'll do our best to address every one of them towards the end of each section. To submit a question or a comment, simply enter it in the questions box on your GoToWebinar window pane, and they will be sent directly to us. To answer one question up front that we typically receive, following today's session, each of you will receive an email that contains links to both the presentation slides and the webinar recording for your continued engagement with this material. So keep an eye out for that email tomorrow. And with that, I will pass it off to Jim to get us started. So take it away, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you all for attending today. We will have well over 100 people on the webinar from, as Eric said, from coast to coast in both the U.S. and Canada. And this is the data that we're using to look at these trends. It is from our State of Facilities in Higher Education. This is our third report that we've done. We did one in 2013 and 2014. As Eric said, over 345 institutions are represented, over 400 campuses in 44 U.S. states as well as 4 Canadian provinces. The data is verified data collected by Sightlines professionals across each of these campuses. About 60% of the campuses are public universities. About 40% are private institutions. There's a mix of different types of institutions on the database. And we've also supplemented the data with a study of 51 campuses that we did for the Canadian Association of University Business Officers of Canadian Universities, all public universities that are part of the data that we'll be showing you today. Our data primarily comes from the Return on Physical Assets, or RUPA Plus process, but we also have looked at data from our building portfolio work, which looks at facilities needs and capital plans and assesses facilities, space utilization data, some of which will be incorporated in here, as well as sustainability solutions, which looks at energy and emissions and has formed the basis for work that we're doing at the University of New Hampshire Institute of Sustainability, in which we will be forthcoming in the next few weeks, a State of Sustainability report, and that's something you should all look for. As I said, we're covering time period 2007 to 2014, looking at data on space, capital, and operations. And this is a very interesting time because, of course, wedged in the middle of this data set is 2008 to 2011, which, of course, across the United States was the so-called Great Recession, in which higher ed was under some tremendous financial pressure. Operating and capital budgets were cut, tuition was flat, financial aid had to go up to keep students in school, and all of you were asked to do more with less. And we were able to get through it, and primarily get through it because of enrollment growth. Enrollment continued to grow during that time. More students were wanting to come to school, and despite the hard times, we were able to have enough revenue to keep things going on college campuses. And from 11 to 13, we started to see this recovery from the recession, and in the reports we did in 13 and 14, we began to highlight that things were turning the corner. Some campuses were getting more resources, both capital and operational. But the latest, for some of you, that's not happened. And some of the latest data suggests some very new challenges that you're facing, and particularly as we look at the enrollment side for many of you. So I'll outline these issues, and you'll have a chance, as Eric said, to write in your questions. We'll answer some of those as we go along, and certainly at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to start with space and looking at the space trends. And the first trend that I want to focus on is the question of space versus enrollment growth. And so this looks at enrollment growth on the line from 2007 to 2014 and space growth. So how much new enrollment and new space and how much of that has grown over this 7-year period. And you can see that early on in this period of time, enrollment was growing very rapidly, and we hit 8% over a 4-year period, about 2% a year. And space was, we were actually building less space than enrollment growth. People started to realize that more students were coming, and we needed to start building up that space. And for many campuses, it takes a long time for space to get built, 2 or 3 years. And so we're beginning to see that some of the space built in 2012 and 13 and 14 actually was responding to a trend that had occurred 2 or 3 years earlier. But what's happening in many parts of the country, particularly the Northeast and the Midwest of the United States, less in places like Texas and Utah and some other places across the country, but what is happening nationally when we look at the national data is the enrollment numbers have leveled off and in fact are beginning to go down in terms of percentage growth. There's still more students in 2014 than there were in 2007 by about 7%, but that continued growth in enrollment has not sustained. However, we're continuing to build square footage. We'll get into this in a few more minutes, but one of the clear implications here is that tuition revenue is not growing, but the debt that has occurred as a result of enrollment growth and space growth is on the books and has to be paid for. We looked at this by constituent group, and one caveat here is that we have a fairly small number of community colleges on this data set, and so, you know, this may not be reflective of everything that we've seen here of community colleges across the country. But the only types of institutions where the line on enrollment growth is not kind of crossing the space growth are research institutions. Research institutions actually continue to grow in enrollment and have been pretty modest in their growth in space. You can see comprehensive and doctoral institutions have grown over 14% space. They've gotten a big increase in students, but that's very much leveled off last 3 years. Community colleges, after a huge spike and now responding to that spike by building more space, have actually begun to see a drop-off from that spike, although they are, as we see here, 17% above where they were in 2007. The most troubling are smaller institutions. These are institutions that have less than 3,000 students, and our students, and as you can see, they're basically back at 2007 levels in terms of enrollment, but they've built quite a bit more space. We're going to take a look at the kind of space that was built in a few minutes. When we take a look at total space per student, and what we've seen is not a dramatic, but pretty steady growth here, both at the public and the private and the national average in terms of the amount of space per student growing. So you can see that back in 2007, on the public side, it was just below 300. On the private side, it was about 575. So quite a few more students going on public campuses than private campuses on a square foot basis. But the national average has grown, as you can see, from around 400 to about 450. So we are adding more space faster than we are adding students, and as a result, you're seeing there is more space per student. What kind of space is there? And that is what this, we went back, we looked at every the building that was built on our database going back to 1880, and we classified it as whether it was academic space or non-academic space. And what we're seeing is essentially a 100-year trend. 1915 was the biggest gap between academic and non-academic space, where people were building about 70% of the space was academic, about 30% of the space was non-academic. Over the last 100 years, we have steadily built less academic space and more non-academic space. And we're getting close to the point where it's about 50-50 on college campuses in terms of new construction. Now, some of this makes sense because some of the non-academic space, particularly residential space, can get paid for by cost of housing and board, and so it's revenue producing. Athletic space can be revenue producing. Even dining space can be revenue producing, and so I think we're seeing that. Also, from a non-academic standpoint, with the growth of online learning over the last few years, you may need fewer classrooms because students are not coming to class physically coming to class. They're taking more and more courses online. Yet it is concerning, and particularly when we looked at those small institutions, we found that the growth on small institutions was very much in the non-academic area. New dorms, recreation centers, new dining opportunities, things that they thought could attract students. But as I go back and show you that chart a couple of slides ago, you could see that the small institutions, basically, that hasn't worked as an aggregate. For individual institutions, certainly there are individual institutions that have built new space and it's helped them attract new students or keep the enrollment they have. But for most small institutions, this has not paid off as much as I think they thought it was going to pay off, and they've got the additional debt of taking on the new space. Now, what's the type of space and when it was built is really critical as we look at issues around capital investment and backlog. And those of you who've been following our state of facilities, this chart's been in the state of facilities every year for the last 3 years. It looks at what percentage of the total constructed space in our database, the 1.5 billion, was built in a certain year. And you can see that the post-war era continues to be the peak era, 1955 to 1975, that 20-year period, of which 35% of all the square footage on our campuses was built during that point in time. Now, this actually has come down as a percentage of total because that total complex era from 1995 essentially to current is at 31% now. That's growing. We're continuing to grow space in this complex era. What's important is the chart across the top. Obviously, pre-war space, built before 1951, iconic buildings, durable construction, built to last. They need programmatic updates, but they're still the bones are solid and they're in good shape. The post-war space was of lower quality construction. Baby boomers were coming to school. Federal government was adding money for research. The campuses were growing. The land grant campuses grew dramatically during this time. And so, as a result, things were built fast, lower quality construction. You know these buildings, flat roof, casement windows, brick buildings that many of you are struggling with and have very high levels of deferred maintenance. Those buildings, all built between 1955 and 1975, have either hit 50 years if they haven't been, the clock on those buildings for the building systems hasn't been reset, or will hit 50 years in the next 10 years. And so this peak is not over. We're seeing the deferred maintenance that's coming forward in these buildings. The life cycles have not been reset in the buildings, and that big spike is part of what our, in Sightlines terms, we call this the asset reinvestment need or the catch-up need. That's critical. And many of these buildings, people are finding maybe they shouldn't even continue to have these buildings. They ought to demolish them and replace them with something else. The complex era buildings are a little bit different in that they are more technically complex. They are buildings that maybe are more expensive to maintain and keep at high quality because of the complexity of the systems, but we find them they're higher quality. They are more like the pre-war buildings from the standpoint of built to last. It's just that they're very complex and require maybe a different set of people to be able to deal with those. So that age profile, that when things were built are important, and we'll come back to this in a couple minutes. We also looked at that construction age, so how that those time frames, under what percentage of space is under 10, what percentage of space 10 to 25, what percentage of space is in the 25 to 50, and in the over 50 eras. And then we looked at renovation age. And this renovation age, for those who already are members of Sightlines, you know that it means more than 50% of the replacement value was invested in this building, and the mechanical systems, clock of mechanical systems was reset, and new life cycles were put in place so the building acts like a new building. The renovation age, as you can see, very interesting. About 20% is under 10, 25%, 10 to 25, 31%, 25 to 50, and 24% over 50. And of course, as you go up to from under 10 to over 50, the risk factors go up. And that is that major life cycles and building components are past due, and the risk of failure comes up. But what we are seeing here is where you've targeted your capital dollars for resetting the clock, gut renovations of buildings. And it's been on the over 50 space. In construction age, 37% of the square footage should be over 50 years old right now, but renovation age is 24%. So you've made these buildings newer. They are more complex now. You've added new systems, and you've brought them up and to basically address some of the millennial expansion. And some of the under 10 buildings are part of that new space that's been constructed. So we've seen a combination of new space and renovation through replacement that's reset the clock on buildings. What's interesting is that 25 to 50-year-old space, which in many cases is some of that poorly constructed, poor quality spaces, hasn't changed. It's still there, about 30%. And it tells me also that some of you are sitting and waiting to see what you're going to do with some of those 60s and 70s buildings that you haven't made the decision on whether you're going to reset the clock and renovate them or maybe get rid of those buildings. And so there's some waiting on the sidelines here for some of those buildings. This is how it looks like public versus private. You can see that there's been a little bit more progress on resetting the clock on private campuses, public campuses, than on private campuses. 42% of that 25 to 50 was in 2007. That's down to 34%. So you can see that public universities, which tend to have more of this space anyway, of that era space, are actually attacking that space a little more aggressively than the private. You can see the private campuses have quite a bit of space over 50 and have always had a lot of space over 50. Not necessarily a bad thing from the standpoint that many of these are those iconic buildings, some of which have been renovated completely and some have not. So let's take a look now at capital and how investing in capital has affected the square footage of these buildings.
Hey, Jim, we have a quick question
Oh, sure.
on space. If you go back to the space per student slide.
Yes, be glad to.
The question is, how does space per student compare to 30 to 40 years ago?
I think we'd have to calculate that. It's an excellent question. I think certainly this is a growth trend. I don't think there's any question that we're seeing additional square footage be added, net new square footage over the last 20 to 30 years. And so I would think that our peaks probably were somewhere in terms of enrollment between the 2007 and 2011 period, as we showed the enrollment numbers kind of dropping off 12, 13, and 14. So the fact that they continue to go up even though enrollment growth is not as robust as it was earlier suggests to me that these numbers are probably higher than they were 20, 30 years ago. Great question. We can go back and calculate it, though, because we shouldn't be able to get that data. We have both student data and space data. Any other questions there?
No other questions so far.
Okay, so let's go to capital and our capital trends. The recession hit hard, and this data, we've shown these data before. In 2009, on average, campuses were spending a little bit more than $5 a square foot. $3.86 came from one-time sources, which are gifts, grants, bonds, in the case of public institutions, state capital funding. $1.27 came from the annual capital budget in the institution. Remember, we go in and calculate that and find out the source of all capital investment data and all projects, and so heavily one-time capital. In 2010, there was huge drops, in particularly the one-time capital. State governments stopped funding, some of the private institutions stopped bonding, and there was a drop back of over $1 a square, just about $1 a square foot. That is, I'm sorry, not just about 70 cents a square foot or so. That's a significant amount of money, considering if you multiply that by 1.5 billion square feet, basically lost over $1 billion worth of funding during in a one-year period. That's a huge amount of loss, and it's taken a long time to get back. As you can see, at 13 we got about even where we were with 2009, and 2014 is the first time we're seeing total capital investment exceeding what we spent in 2009. So it's been a steady capital growth over the last 5 years. The difference is the makeup, and we're going to go into that, but particularly if you go back to 2009, $3.86 was one-time capital. It's $3.60 in 2014. The difference is that $127 is now $177. We actually are 50 cents a square foot, and again, I remind you, we're talking about 1.5 billion square feet. So $750 million additional annual capital being spent by the Sightlines campuses here, what we call annual stewardship. That is regular money that's built in to the campus budget for annual capital in order to address capital investment needs. Let's take a look at this by type of institution. You can see, again, something that sticks out. The research institutions have the highest levels of spending, particularly private research institutions, and they also have the highest levels of annual capital. The small institutions have grown their level of annual capital, but still have not recovered back to 2009 levels. Community colleges seen a drop off the last couple of years as enrollment has started to drop in some of the community colleges that we work with. And again, I'm not saying this is true for every community college, but just the database we have. And the comprehensive doctoral actually have bigger recovery also back to 2009 levels. When we look at this by public and private, we see a dramatic difference in two ways. One, private spending is over $7 a square foot compared to public university spending, which is the capital investment, which has been give or take $4 a square foot in the entire time we're looking at. And the makeup hasn't changed much in the private sector, public sector. In the private sector, the makeup has changed significantly. If you go back to 2009, they were spending about $6.50 a square foot. It's over $7 now. But you can look at the blue, light blue, $4.97 came from one-time capital. $4.44 came from one-time capital in 2014. But the amount going into from the annual capital budget institutions, $1.63 gone up to $2.82. So you're seeing campuses, particularly on the private sector side, really get aggressive in terms of making sure that the institution funds more of the institutional budget, funds more of the annual capital program, something that, of course, if you work with Sightlines, we advocate for, we preach that this important, steady, ongoing investment is critical to success. And we were also seeing that, by the way, for the public sector. If you look back in 2010, it was about 91 cents. It grew to $1.19, but it's fallen back a little bit. And capital fell back in 2014 as a result of some states starting to pull back even more and institutions feeling some of the squeeze on the enrollment side. We started to see some reductions in capital funding. We also calculated the percentage of funding that came from essentially the funding mix. Where did it come from? As you can see on the public institutions, it's been about the same, right around 25% comes from the institution, about 75% comes from primarily the state, or for those public institutions that have bonding authority, comes from bonding. On the private side, it was 75-25 in 2009. That has changed dramatically. In a period of 6 years, we now are at almost 60-40, where 61% is coming from one-time capital, primarily borrowing, bonding, as well as potentially money from endowment, and 39% is coming from annual capital budgets in the institutional capital. So the whole arrangement in the mix of capital and where the source of capital is very much changing at private institutions And if you're a private institution that hasn't seen this kind of mixed change, then you know your philosophy is a little bit different than other people who are saying we just can't rely on one-time capital and borrowing. That steady annual funding is our best case scenario. When we wanted to drill down into these trends because you know they're pretty dramatic change here, particularly on the private side. So we took a look at whether or not we had anything that our work and our analysis and metrics had anything to do with a change in capital funding. And so we looked at 50 campuses that became members of Sightlines in 2011, both public and private, and we looked at what their capital investment was the 3 years prior to joining Sightlines, and what were their capital investment 3 years after they had done the ROPA analysis. And we found that there was a 54% increase in annual capital, and there was a growth in overall capital, but almost no growth, 1 cent a square foot growth in one-time capital. So what happened is that people didn't necessarily go out and borrow a whole bunch more money and decide that they're going to increase that one-time capital to deal with the needs that were identified through the ROPA analysis. But what instead is that boards became convinced that the important way of, and presidents became convinced that an important way of dealing with ongoing facilities needs is to have a steady, reliable annual capital budget. It went up from 72 cents a square foot to $1.11 a square foot, a 54% increase. I also want to take a look at where the capital dollars are being spent. So remember, for those of you who work with us, we take every capital project and classify it. Is it space renewal, safety code, an envelope work, roofs, foundations, windows, doors, building systems like HVAC, electrical, and plumbing, or is it utility infrastructure and grounds? And we found that on the left-hand side, the public institutions have changed their philosophy. Even though they've only had about $4 a square foot, give or take, they've actually seen a pretty steady shift away from space renewal, where 44% of the money went to space renewal and safety code in 2007. Now that's down to 36%, and the growth has been in both envelope and building systems and in infrastructure. So public sector institutions are doing more work behind the walls here and a little bit less on space. It doesn't mean they're not doing something on space, but it's taking a lesser priority, and more is going to the infrastructure and the building systems and the building envelope than ever before. In private sector, there hasn't been much change, but remember, private sector institutions are spending $2.50 to $3 a square foot more than public institutions, and so as a result, they've been pretty steady, but they still do continue to invest at significant levels, about the same as public sector in terms of envelope and building systems, a little bit less in the infrastructure, although some of the private institutions are a little bit smaller and have less infrastructure to invest in. Why is this important? Well, when we look at our data, we've actually looked at life cycles of the envelope, systems, space, and safety code, and the data that's come from our analysis of the building portfolio, facilities condition analysis, and capital funding has helped us to determine these numbers. So you can see the envelope, an investment in envelope lasts over 30 years. An investment in systems, 25 years. We're finding space investments last about 7 to 10 years. Basically, people change out space at a pretty fast rate, and painting and carpeting and interior repairs and upgrades tend to be changed pretty quickly, and so the return on investment is not as high. Safety code a little bit, just under 15 years. So the big high ROI investments are envelope and systems, and I think you realize this. You're realizing that these are the things that are paying off, and we're seeing a significant shift across all our institutions towards envelope and systems work. Now, yes, the capital funding has come back to some extent. Certainly hasn't gone down much in the public sector, stayed pretty steady. Yet that age profile, and particularly those 55 to 75, that high percentage of space, is just trumping any type of capital investment. We just are not able to keep up, to catch up with all of the 50s and 60s and 70s buildings that are coming due, renovate them, and maintain the existing campuses and address the existing buildings and address the life cycles of better space that was built after that time or even before that time, and make sure that we're keeping up. And so as a result, we're seeing pretty steady climbs in the backlog despite that. So age seems to be more important than capital investment, which gets back to the question of competition for funding. Looking at this chart, the public backlog is just under $100 a square foot. The private backlog just over $80 a square foot. The public has grown at a little faster rate than the private. We've seen a couple of years where some of the private has leveled off. But part of this is that whole competition for funding that we're seeing out there between the deferred maintenance that's needed to invest in those particularly 50s and 60s buildings and 70s buildings, and new space that wants to be built to address some of the demands and the competitive demands that you have to compete with better science and engineering facilities as well as student life facilities. And so we're seeing this real competition back and forth, and the backlog continues to grow and cause a lot of problems for many of your campuses. Let me ask Eric if there's any questions on the capital funding side before we go to operations.
No additional questions at this time.
Good. So I'm going to go now directly to operations. I'd like to be able to tell you the facility operating budgets are providing some relief, and in the last couple of years they actually provided a little bit, but from 2008 to 2012, almost all of you were facing flat funding for operations. We've broken this down on our daily service, which is the cost of maintenance, custodial, and grounds, staff, as well as any contracts, and then planned and preventive maintenance that we've been able to pull out of your work order systems and document the amount of dollars per square foot, or in this case cents per square foot, that's being spent on planned and preventive maintenance. And you can see that from 2008 to 2012, the publics were completely flat. In fact, even went down a little bit. The privates grew, but very, very modestly, certainly less than the rate of inflation. But the last couple of years, we've seen on both the public and private side some growth. Some of this we think is benefits, growth and benefits cost, and some salary, long overdue salary increases. Not necessarily new people, but just the cost of doing business has gone up. In the case of the public sector, 388 to 413. In the case of the private sector, we went up from about 478 to 498. The other thing just to point out is despite flat budgets, we've actually seen some growth in the PM on the private side, public side, from 25 cents a square foot back in 2007 and 8 all the way to 30 cents a square foot. On the private side, from 32 cents a square foot back in 2007 to 42 cents a square foot. Doesn't sound like a lot, but when you add 5 or 10 cents a square foot and you're dealing with 1.5 billion square feet, it adds up. And these are significant dollars from the standpoint that what we have found based on some independent studies of our database is that a dollar of investment in planned maintenance actually turns out to be about equivalent to $2.73 in reactive maintenance. So what we did is we looked at campuses and projects and cases where there wasn't planned maintenance and looked at the cost of work orders and doing those work orders in advance in a planned and preventive way versus the cost of corrective and emergency work orders for the same type of work. And we found that essentially, we've been telling you a lot of you this for a number of years, costs 2 to 3 times more to wait until things break and you're having to do them on an emergency basis. So those of you who are aggressive in investing in planned and preventive maintenance, we think you will save money in daily service in the long run and be able to operate with a lower daily service budget. Well, I said earlier that the growth in operations funding in the last couple of years was not coming because the result of increased staffing, and here are the data to prove that. Take a look at the national average here on custodial coverage. We'll start with that. The national average coverage rates have gone up from just under 35,000 to now over 35,000 gross square feet per FTE. So the higher the number means fewer people. And as a result, there are either fewer people or custodians have not been added as square footage has been added. Remember, we've seen this growth in square footage. And so what's happened is you've just stretched your staff further, make them clean more space as a result of adding the square footage. You've added square footage, but not added people. The public average stayed about the same, just over 35,000. The private average has gone up significantly from just over 30 all the way to 35,000. We also track cleanliness score that we rate independently on each of your campuses, and you can see that the cleanliness score nationally has dropped down a little bit from just over 4 to down to around just right at about 4.0. The public average is just right about at that level, and the private average has actually dropped fairly, not significantly, but certainly around 4.2, 4.23 to just about 4.15. That suggests to us, at least, particularly on the private side, some of you have suggested that the cleanliness level could go down a little bit, and everybody will still be fairly happy on campus, and that people will accept slightly lower levels of cleanliness when you stretch your custodial staff. Maintenance coverage, we've also seen an increase in maintenance coverage. I think the same thing's happening. People are asked to do more with less. Again, less about cuts, but more about new space and no new staff. All of you have heard this story. The national average has gone up from a little bit over 80,000 to almost 90,000 square feet per FTE. We've seen that same kind of growth in the public and same kind of growth in the private. I know some of my colleagues in the public sector will say, well, things are all way better in the public sector, but interesting enough, in both custodial and in maintenance, the private sector institutions are actually at the same coverage level that the public sector institutions. They don't see much difference at all. And so, these basically coverage rates are the same, and they weren't a few years ago, but they've changed pretty significantly over the last few years, particularly on the private campus side. We haven't seen any change in the maintenance rates here. The rate, we didn't graph that here, but our scoring of repair and rates of maintenance, quality of maintenance, stayed just about the same despite the coverage increases. Let me see if there are questions on staffing here before we go to the next section, which will be on energy and emissions.
Yeah, Jim, before we move on to the energy data, we have a quick question regarding the custodial trends and the scoring. What is the criteria for the cleanliness score?
So we basically take the APA cleanliness score criteria. We've kind of built them into a 1 to 5 rating scale for us. So we basically look at, create a scorecard that looks at the quality of the cleanliness ratings based on, how the floor is clean, is there dust, is there, papers around, how are the bathrooms, how are the common areas, how are classrooms cleaned, and we basically use a set of scoring criteria, and our staff looks at a sample of buildings, different age groups of buildings every time we go on campus. So let me now move to the energy and emissions trends. This is not in the state of sustainability, the state of facilities, but because you're on the webinar, you get a chance to see some highlights that's coming on a joint report that Sightlines is going to publish soon with the University of New Hampshire Institute of Sustainability, called the State of Sustainability in Higher Education. And so what we've looked at are Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, so not recycling and some of the other transportation related, but generate gross emissions, either stationary emissions that are generated by you, or emissions as a result of electricity that you've bought off the grid. Emissions are actually down in a modest way, about 5%. When we look at total, energy consumption is actually up about 3%. That's not surprising since space has gone up about 8%. So, when you add more buildings, you're going to generate more consumption, and that is what we've seen happen, particularly the last couple of years. When we normalize the Scope 1 and Scope 2, we see that when we look at it on a square foot basis, and the way people look at it as metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions per 1,000 gross square feet, the peak was 2008. That was true nationally, by the way, also when you look at national data for all types of industries. And we've seen about a 13% decline in emissions on a normalized basis since 2007 on the campuses that we calculate this on both stationary Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Consumption is also down, but less, about 2%. The last couple of years, there was very cold winters in 13 and 14, and that seems to have affected some of the consumption, as well as the growth in space is affecting the consumption. So how could this happen? How could you have a 13% decline in emissions and only a 3% decline in consumption? Aren't they related? And that'd be a good question, and the answer is about fuel mix. The main source of reduction of emissions has not come because consumption efforts for energy conservation have been wildly successful on college campuses. Certainly there are some campuses where there's been significant success. We were able to document in this report a number of campuses that have had between 25 and 50% reduction in emissions over the last 5 years. So we've definitely seen campuses that are very aggressive and successful, but by and large they were offset by other campuses that are increasing consumption. But the big difference is fuel mix. In 2007, natural gas constituted 74% of all of the stationary fuel mix that you were consuming on college campuses. By 2014, that had gone up to 87%. A sea change. People basically reduced coal from 17% to 10%, reduced other fuels, primarily oil, from 9 to 3%. We did not calculate in here the amount of renewables, but they are also on the rise, but they're still relatively modest. The big difference is that people have dramatically moved from coal and oil to natural gas, and it's a cleaner burning fuel. And also, when you look at your grids, the grids have all gotten cleaner as a result of your utility companies moving from coal and oil to natural gas also. Cost matters when it comes to consumption. We studied consumption by the type regions across the country, and we looked at the far west, New England, Mideast, Plains and Rockies, Southeast, and Great Lakes. And we also looked at degree days on the top of the chart, and it's a complicated chart because you've got degree days on the top, you've got your consumption ratings on BTUs per square foot, and then the lines are the cost. So the highest cost areas are on the left-hand side, far west, New England, and Mideast, and they consume the least. The cheapest costs are on the right-hand side, the Plains, the Southeast, and the Great Lakes, and they consume a higher amount than the West Coast, New England, and Mideast. When you take a look at degree days, it's very interesting. If you compare New England, which has 7,114 degree days, average degree days over this period of time we looked at this, in the Great Lakes, 6951, so pretty comparable. You can see that New England campuses are just under 120,000 BTUs per square foot. Midwest campuses, Great Lakes campuses are almost 170,000 BTUs per gross square foot. So 50,000 more BTUs per gross square foot, same degree days. So when cost is a big factor here, when things are cheaper, people consume more. And when things are more costly, people clearly are more aggressive on their conservation. And so those are important factors when we look at this going across. And of course, we'll have a lot more on this when we get to our state of sustainability. Eric, do you have a question?
Yeah, we don't have any questions on the energy data, but we have another question regarding the custodial staffing, coverages, and the output. Are there any correlations between in-house and contracted staff when it comes to custodial?
Yeah, we did not look at that. We do measure that, and that's a good question, something maybe we can answer in a blog going out after this. You can take a look and see. I've not seen significant differences, but in a lot of cases, contracted staff don't clean the same space. People will contract for, say, their athletic facilities or their convocation facilities or convention facilities on campus, and not classrooms and dorms where things are being cleaned every single day. And so you have to kind of also adjust for that factor. Okay, thank you for that question, for those of you who are watching. So let me kind of summarize the trends and then get in for the last few minutes of the webinar to what we can do about it. There's not a lot of great news here. I wish I could give you better news. Aging campuses are driving the need to renovate and replace that 60s and 70s space, many of which of those buildings are poorly constructed. Add to the problem, you've added a lot of square footage to address increased enrollment. In some cases, across parts of the country, that enrollment's leveled off significantly. The demand for catch-up of the aging buildings and keeping up the newer buildings is relentless, and it is significant, and it's higher than the availability of capital funding. The backlogs are growing, despite the fact that capital funds in aggregate are at least at pre-recession levels. Flat operating budgets have not provided you any relief, and energy consumption, after some gains early on in this period from 2007 to 2014, leveled off, and emissions have primarily gone down as a result of fuel switching. So if things are so bad, why aren't we seeing more building failures and major facility problems? Essentially, why isn't the roof caved in? As Rick Beatingwig said back in 1985 when he wrote a piece for APA that said, you know, before the roof caves in, we need to act. And essentially, we haven't been able to keep up with many and catch up at the same time. And why hasn't the roof caved in? Well, there's a couple of important reasons. Number one, we think that campuses have better data. They're able to manage the most critical repair risks. People are deciding what to do. Not all buildings are created equal, and so you're thinking about this in a more strategic way. You have a lot more data that we've helped provide and other that you've provided for yourself, and we've been able to really look at this and determine what are the best ways to manage the risk and what are the best places to invest money. Second, systems tend to outperform statistical targets. Work with a lot of our colleagues, do facilities conditions assessments, and we find that most of the needs are identified in the next 1 to 3 and 3 to 5 year time period. But what we find is that a lot of when we've studied life cycles, a lot of these building systems outperform their life cycles because you're pretty good at, you know, band-aiding them together and keeping them working. And so as a result, and you've also provided some lower cost repairs to the system. So rather than replace that entire HVAC system, you've replaced the fan unit, kept it running more efficiently, and bought some extra service time rather than investing in full system replacement. Third, campuses are a collection of buildings. The risks are spread out. It is not like your house where if the roof's leaking, you got to go fix it because you don't have any place else to live. If the HVAC system goes out, you've got to bring in somebody in and replace it and have a new heating system, or else you're cold in the winter and hot in the summer. Building campuses have ways of moving people around, using other classrooms, temporarily shutting down buildings, and so you don't have to fix everything all at once. And people diversify that risk over a portfolio of buildings and have been doing it pretty successfully. Finally, functional obsolescence of space drives investments, and in many cases brings outside resources. Grants and other funding comes to deal with the space and gives the ability of institutions to move more money towards the facilities departments to move more money to envelope and mechanical and infrastructure investments. And so some of those space investments we're seeing are actually coming from sources other than the institutional or a state capital program. They're coming as a result of grants that your departments are getting from, say, research grants. So one of the other things that we're seeing is that in order to be successful, people are making the problem smaller. I think for a long time, people said, we need to have a big number here for the backlog and deferred maintenance because then everybody will take notice. What we're actually finding in our work with campuses is that when the big number is put in front of the board or put in front of the state legislature, they tend to freeze. It prevents action rather than encourages action. And one of the ways that we're seeing that the people are successful in getting additional resources and focusing additional resources are by rethinking the problem and trying to make the problem divided into smaller pieces. One, by understanding that not all buildings are created equal, and so they shouldn't be treated that way. We're going to invest in some buildings and not in others. It's okay to have a set of, say, so-called transitional buildings that we know at some point we're going to knock those buildings down and we're just not going to put any money into it. No matter what the occupants say and want, we're going to realize that if that building's going away in the next 2 to 3 years, we're not going to put any money in it right now. Second, people are breaking their campus into portfolios of work, sort of using the idea of investment portfolios to say, we're going to put money in certain places and more money in certain types of facilities than in other types of facilities, and doing that in both the capital decisions and operational decisions to kind of make the problem smaller. Third, people are dividing their capital projects by issues of reliability, safety code, program, and asset preservation, and setting priorities within those, particularly reliability projects, which means that a building that has high reliable projects and that are problems with the reliability of the building systems, there's imminent failure. And so being able to understand those key issues, what's the most important, what's critical, what could really essentially result in the roof caving in or systems collapsing, we're going to go do those first. And people have created some balance and diversity in their facilities investment with the idea that we're going to lower risks. We're going to try to lower the risk of that over 50 space becoming more and more problematic, that 25 to 50 being more and more problematic, and that younger space keeping it up so that those life cycles don't go past due. One of the other things that we're finding is that, and for those of you who remember the Rolling Stones 1966 song called "Time Is on Our Side," yes, it is. That in fact, we've learned over the past 30 years that you can buy time. You can fix components rather than replacing entire systems. You can understand that life cycles are inherently conservative, and therefore you may have more time than you think. You can coordinate campus needs and projects to lower the cost, so that when you're hiring contractors to renovate one building and you've got electrical contractors on campus, you can do some of those other key electrical projects in other buildings. And the functional obsolescence of space will buy time by bringing in resources from other sources to address some of the repair needs of space. And so there's no reason to believe this is going to change, that steady investment over time is the way to go here. And as a result of what we're seeing and the trends, particularly in the growth of annual stewardship, where campuses are putting more and more of their own resources into capital investment and saying, we've got to have reliable funding source year after year, and we're going to chip away at this problem over time, and over the next 10 years, a multi-year capital plan is going to make a difference. They're manipulating time and money as two key variables. And finally, you're going to have to make the case for resources. I wish I could tell you that all this will go away with just a little bit of money, but the fact is that ultimately you're going to have to make the case for resources. But the people who we're finding, the campuses where facilities and finance are making a successful case for resources, are the campuses where they are showing to the board, the president, in the case of public sector, to the government leaders, that you are controlling the things that you can control. That the old approach of just making the problem bigger and saying, please help us and bail us out, is not going to happen. The problem is just too big. When you start getting into billions of dollars worth of money, people just glaze over and don't know how to address it. And so part of the responsibility of the facilities folks is to do better space management to lower the demand, make the problem smaller using building portfolio management, sustain the impact of finite funding through multi-year plans, and be able to mitigate risk by targeting that capital with critical reliability, safety code, and some asset preservation issues. By applying these actions, people have been successful in making the case for additional funding and have actually reduced the cost of operations and overhead and used those savings to self-fund that stewardship over time. Take a look, though. Those four areas all relate to that general idea of using space, capital, and operations. Understanding, communicating that all building needs are not all building needs are created equal. Using that portfolio kind of approach to break the campus into pieces, investing over time, and when you are able to have savings, reallocate those to support the capital budget. Those are the kind of things that make a difference in terms of being able to be successful in dealing with all three of those. The people who are successful in this era are people who are able to work on all three of these fronts, not just one of them. With that, Eric, I want to see if there's any more questions. We've got about 5 minutes before the end of our webinar, and I'll be glad to answer them.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions here. One from an attendee who very complimentary of today's presentation. They're wondering, have we looked at Canadian institutions? Do you know if there are any notable differences in any of these trends and issues?
Yes, of course, we just finished a study of 51 Canadian universities, and that study showed us a number of things. One, that the deferred maintenance problem is pretty similar to what we're seeing across U.S. campuses, maybe someplace between our private number and our public number. Some of the Canadian campuses, while they have many old buildings, did have some earlier renovations and earlier new space renovations done on some of the older buildings, and so they've been able to reset the clock. But the big difference I think we're seeing on the Canadian campuses is higher density. There are just many, many more students on Canadian campuses than we see on U.S. campuses. Part of that is for the square footage. Part of that is that Canadian campuses tend to be less residential, tend to have less athletic facilities, tend to have less of the recreational and other types of facilities. That could change in the future, but right now it's not unusual to see a 4 to 5 million square foot campus in Canada that has 25 to 30,000 students. While in the U.S. you would tend to have more like 15 to 20,000 students on a campus that size. So you know, you just have just a lot more people on your space. It lowers your facilities overhead, but the problem is that you're grinding those buildings down because you're using them day and night over and over again, and as a result, the deterioration rate that we're seeing on Canadian campuses tends to be faster than what we're seeing on U.S. campuses.
Thanks, Jim. Another question here. Can you expand on the idea of functional obsolescence of space that can bring capital resources to allocate for repairs? What do you mean by that?
Well, we're starting to see campuses, some cases campuses going through some kind of cost allocations process, chargebacks to cost recovery kind of approach to go back to departments, and basically saying to departments, are you generating any kind of revenue that can either go to the capital part of the space, of investing in space, or the operations aspect of investing in space. And so trying to get the departments and their own ability to generate revenue to be able to deal with the space renovations that they want to have, faculty offices upgrades, classroom upgrades, not the core buildings on campus, but you know, the space, not necessarily the mechanical and structural issues, but the space issues. So the idea of functional obsolescence is that, you know, you'll change space before it wears out. There are very few, there are some, but there are very few classrooms across U.S. college campuses and even Canada college campuses that look like the classrooms that look like they did 30, 40 years ago. People upgrade classrooms to respond to changes in teaching and changes in technology, and they will tend to continue to do that and change out those spaces faster than they wear out. So we're seeing campuses that are doing this strategically and being successful, asking more of the departments to lift some of this capital investment.
Thanks, Jim. One last question. With enrollment reducing and overabundance of space, have you seen decommissioning of buildings? If so, are there any trends?
Yes. We just had a presentation from Tony Calcato, who's head of facilities at Rutgers, and said that demolition is my favorite word. We're seeing on a number of campuses people just saying that, you know, we need to divest from the buildings that are those 50s and 60s buildings that are not in good shape, that are falling apart. We'll either eliminate them and live without that square footage, or we will attack those buildings by going through renovation for replacement. We have two states that are really active in this. Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education has gone through a significant change as a result of renovation for replacement. You knock a building down, there's state funding available to build a new building in its place. And the state of Maine. The Maine system has also, we cite this in both of these examples in our State of Facilities paper, where the state of Maine, because of significant declining enrollment, has decided to go on a program to reduce their total square footage across their 7 campuses by 10%, by eliminating the lowest use buildings that are in poorest conditions, that are non-historic buildings, but really attacking some of those poor condition buildings that aren't being used and saying we're going to have to learn to live without it. So I think this is a growing trend. We've got a number of campuses that have either implemented or are considering implementing a no net new space policy. And so I think it's important for people to be thinking more and more about the idea that one way of eliminating deferred maintenance is to eliminate the building. Now, you also eliminate that square footage, and the question is whether you can live without it, but I think it's becoming more and more of a trend. Any other questions?
No other questions at this time. Thank you, Jim. So that wraps up today's session. We're actually out of time, but if you have any additional questions, please feel free to continue submitting those now. While we wait for those few questions to trickle in, I'd like to let you all know that you will be receiving a post-webinar survey at the conclusion of today's session. The survey is designed to not only get your thoughts on the content of today's presentation, but to also get a sense of the challenges that you face on campus, and with those in mind, what topics you'd like to hear from Sightlines at future events. I'd also like to make sure that I encourage you all to visit the Sightlines website and our Insights page if you'd like to stay current with these trends and any of the latest best practices or innovative facility solutions that we share. Insights is your resource to easily access industry knowledge from both Sightlines and our member institutions. There you'll find blog posts, articles, webinar recordings where this session will be located, and any more information on upcoming events. You also have the opportunity to sign up for our monthly newsletter there as well. So please be sure to check that out from time to time as we frequently update this page with newer information. And it looks like we've addressed all the questions that have been submitted so far. So I'd like to thank you all again for joining us today. And I hope that you enjoyed the session and found the information valuable as you continue to explore ways to create a new facilities conversation on your campus. Please don't hesitate to contact us via our website, sightlines.com, or directly at insights@sightlines.com if you have any additional questions following today's call. Thank you again, and I hope you have a great day.